Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 232 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Before the English settled in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, or the Dutch settled near Albany, New York in 1615, a group of French-speaking Catholic settlers established a settlement at Port Royal, Acadia in 1605, an area that we now know as Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. Now, over time, the Acadian population grew and extended its settlements and villages along the Bay of Fundy, as well as into other New France maritime provinces we know today as New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. And by 1755, nearly 15,000 Acadians lived in Acadia. Christopher Hodson, an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University and the author of The Acadian Diaspora, joins us to investigate the lives of these early North American colonists and how the British government came to displace them from Acadia in 1755. Now, during our investigation, Chris reveals who the Acadians were and how they came to settle in North America, details about how the Acadians lived, farmed, and traded while in Acadia, and why the British government forcibly relocated the Acadians after 1755, and information about some of the places the displaced Acadians landed. But first, we have two meetups coming up. First, I'll meet you in Albany, New York on April 25th. In Albany, I'll be giving a free public talk at the New York State Cultural Education Center called A Visit to Ben Franklin's World. Now, before the talk, there will be a reception where we can meet up and chat a bit before the talk. So if you're in Albany, New York on April 25th, I hope you'll stop by so we can catch up. And if you do need more details about this event, I've placed a link for the talk right in the show notes. Now, second, I'm headed to Wisconsin. Hello, Milwaukee. I'll be coming your way on April 29th. And on the 29th, we'll have a meetup at Zaffiro's Pizza at 6 p.m. Now, if you're interested in this Milwaukee meetup, check out benfranklinsworld.com/meetup, and you'll find all the details you need for it. Again, that's benfranklinsworld.com/meetup. Okay, are you ready to explore some Acadian history? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University. He's the author of numerous articles and published essays, and a book, The Acadian Diaspora, an 18th Century History. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Christopher Hodson.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. We're really excited to explore the Acadian Diaspora with you.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk about it.
Fantastic. So why don't we just jump into it? Now, the Acadian settlement of Nova Scotia predated English settlement in North America. So Acadians lived in Nova Scotia before the English settled in either Jamestown or Plymouth. But when you think about it, rarely does our narrative of early American history ever begin with the Acadians. So Chris, could we start our conversation with a brief overview of who the Acadians were and when and why they settled in Nova Scotia?
Sure. So Acadians are French-speaking Catholic settlers in what are now more or less the Canadian maritime provinces. So Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, and depending on who you ask, kind of down southward into Maine. The settlement of Acadia by these French settlers begins really in 1604 and 1605, when some people you know, including Samuel de Champlain, who later becomes the founder of New France, start a settlement called Port Royal on the Bay of Fundy in what is now Nova Scotia. The settlement kind of proceeds in fits and starts for the first couple of decades, but by the time we get to the 1640s and 50s, there are quite some number of migrants from Western France who have settled in what is now Nova Scotia. And for the most part, they settle in villages along the Bay of Fundy, which again is this major tidal bay that cuts deep into peninsular Nova Scotia. They settle there for a variety of reasons. It is rich agricultural land, and they settle there too for geopolitical reasons. The French are very eager to control the entrance to the St. Lawrence River Valley, which Nova Scotia kind of commands. They're also eager to offset the growing settlement of Massachusetts just to the south of Nova Scotia. So those are some of the reasons for which the French are really eager to create a settlement in what is now Nova Scotia, which was then called, of course, the French colony of Acadia.
Now that we know where and why the Acadians settled, I wonder if you would tell us a bit more about how they lived and farmed. Because the Acadians had this really interesting ability to transform really seemingly useless marshland into productive farm fields. So would you tell us a bit more about how they lived and how they transformed and reclaimed that land?
Sure. One of the remarkable features of the Bay of Fundy, and hopefully some of your listeners have actually visited the Bay of Fundy because it's an unbelievable place, is that it has the highest tidal variations in the world. So the Bay of Fundy more or less acts like a gigantic funnel. And as the tides go in and out, the bay, of course, narrows and shallows, which means that the tides are incredibly high. So the tidal variation can be as much as 40 feet in some places, and as much as 4 cubic miles of water, if you can sort of imagine that, flows in and out of the bay every tidal sequence. So what that produces is giant areas of tidal marshland. And those marshlands are exceptionally rich as far as soil goes, right? They've been washed over by organic material from the sea many, many times over. There's lots of hardy marine grasses that grow on them. And so they're exceptionally good for farming. The problem, of course, is that the tides wash over them twice every day. So what the Acadians managed to do is actually import diking technology from France and implant it in the Bay of Fundy. So more or less what they do is they go into the marshes and using these long, sharp spades, they hack out these blocks of sod, more or less, that they call gazon. And then they take these gazon and they build dikes, and each of these dikes has a sluice in it, which is more or less a pipe made from a hollowed out log or hollowed out logs. So what these dikes do basically is block, of course, the rising tides from getting onto these fields that the Acadians are trying to dry out. The sluice, or the pipe in the bottom of the dike, actually allows for the drainage of salt water out of the field. And it's got a little clapper on the end of it that the Acadians really ingeniously build that snaps shut whenever the salty water rises to meet it. And in fact, most of these settlers actually learned how to do this back in Western France. So it's this really amazing importation of a European environmental technology into a New World setting. So what they wind up doing is creating unbelievably rich and productive farmland out of what had once been seen as useless marshland. So for the Acadians, the marshes are really the most crucial part of the settlement. It allows them to eat, it allows them to trade, and it allows them to practice agriculture, and this is really crucial, I think, in a way that gets them out of the way of the Micmac, who are the indigenous people in and around Acadia, and who spend most of their time hunting in the uplands. So what's really fascinating about Acadian marshland is not only that it's really productive and they grow all sorts of crops and so forth on this rich farmland that they themselves have created, but that farmland allows them to pursue relatively peaceful relationships with the Micmac, which really serves their society incredibly well.
Now, how did the Acadians use this land that they dried out? I mean, what types of crops are they able to grow in this reclaimed marshland?
Acadians are growing all kinds of things. So they grow wheat, they grow rye, they grow peas, they grow garden crops, they grow all sorts of things on these marshland fields that they've created via these dikes. And one of the things that's sort of most remarkable about Acadia is that early on in the 17th century, and especially during the 18th century, everybody who ventures into Acadia, whether they're French or British, one of the first things they remark is that, and they always use the same terminology. They say, this province, these marshlands could be the granary for so many different settlements. So when people from Massachusetts, for instance, come up to Nova Scotia to trade, they're always kind of struck by the richness of this farmland and all that it can produce. And so on the one hand, the Acadians' marshland agriculture is, of course, really, really good for them. It produces food that they themselves consume, and it produces wheat and so forth that they then trade to other people, sometimes French people, sometimes British people. On the other hand, that marshland is so productive that it makes all sorts of people want to acquire it. So in many respects, marshland agriculture is a kind of double-edged sword for the Acadian settlers along the Bay of Fundy.
I'm really curious about the trade between the Acadians and the people of Massachusetts Bay, because Massachusetts was a colony established by Puritans, and Puritans really didn't think highly of the Catholic Church. And yet here you have these Catholic Acadians trading with the Puritans. So would you tell us a bit more about this trade and how it developed?
So Acadian trade with Massachusetts develops very, very early on in the 17th century. Acadians themselves sometimes refer to the folks in Massachusetts as nos amis les ennemis, which basically means our friends, the enemy. And I think that's a really good encapsulation of the relationship they have with folks in Massachusetts. They are very eager to trade with people in Massachusetts. They have agricultural produce that folks in Massachusetts want. Folks in Massachusetts have all sorts of trade goods, manufactured goods, and so forth that the Acadians want. And so it's a pretty natural development. I should say, too, that Acadia switches hands quite some number of times in the 17th century and then, of course, later on in the 18th century. The English rule Nova Scotia for some number of years in the 1630s. They rule Nova Scotia from the mid-1650s to 1670s. The Dutch actually lay claim to Nova Scotia, or Acadia, during the 1670s. And so Acadians are pretty used to the territory that they live in changing hands. And so they're more or less open to trading with a variety of people because for all they know, those people are going to be ruling them in the coming years. And so, to be sure, in religious terms, Acadian Catholics and Massachusetts Puritans don't particularly get along well. As far as trading goes, however, they're willing to overlook, it seems to me, in the 17th century, most of those religious differences for pragmatic reasons. They have a lot to offer each other, and they do.
You raise a really interesting point. How were the Acadians able to weather all of these imperial rivalries and changes about them? Because when you do look at a place like New Netherland or Brazil or many other colonies really do seem to change imperial hands quite a bit, and the way they change hands is not always peaceful.
That's true. And it's important, I think, to keep in mind that there are relatively few Acadian settlers for most of the 17th centuries. So when Acadia is, in fact, changing hands, again, multiple times during the 17th century, we're not talking about all that many people. And the Acadians are well aware that they lack the kind of numerical superiority that, for instance, Massachusetts enjoys over them. So they're well aware of their kind of minimal position within the geopolitical order of things. So they know that as far as their own ability to make trouble goes for any of the empires that might confront them, it's not really in their interest to be particularly aggressive. It's in their interest to, in fact, be accommodating. And that's one of the really interesting things about the Acadians is they get quite used to the idea that their homeland might change hands some number of times in their lifetime. And so there is a kind of culture of accommodation that predates their actual declarations of neutrality, which they make in the 18th century.
Do we know how many Acadians lived in Nova Scotia during the 17th century and how that population would have grown, over the 18th century?
In the 17th century, by the end of the 17th century, we're talking about a few thousand Acadian settlers. By the time we get to 1755, when the Acadians are, as I talk about in my book, expelled from Nova Scotia really violently by the British Empire, there are something like 15,000 or so Acadians in what we would now describe as Acadia. So that is the contemporary population of Boston, roughly, in 1755. So it's not an insignificant number of people, but at the same time, those people are scattered over a wide area. There are lots and lots of these little villages on the Bay of Fundy. There are plenty of little fishing villages on the other side of Nova Scotia, the Atlantic-facing side of Nova Scotia. There are even smaller villages on what was then Ile Saint-Jean, which is now Prince Edward Island. And so it's a much more dispersed population than you might find in an urban center like Boston. So to be sure, it's not an insignificant number of people, but they are widely dispersed throughout a really large area. And that, I think, limits their ability to act militarily against the British Empire.
So Before we move into 1755, which really did seem to be a pivotal year for the Acadians, would you tell us a bit more about how they set up their towns and governance? What did the structure of their villages look like?
Their villages, for the most part, kind of run along the shores of the Bay of Fundy. And these are relatively small agricultural villages. They are centered on the fields that they've created through diking and on marshland agriculture. During British rule in Nova Scotia, which takes up most of the 18th century prior to 1755, these are, of course, for the most part, Catholic peoples. And so they, through negotiation with the British government, they do enjoy the presence of Catholic missionaries. And so they do have a parish structure to their lives. And the Catholic Church is a major kind of ordering force within Acadian communities. I guess the other really striking thing about these Acadian villages is that they are always under a certain amount of pressure. So after the British take over Acadia kind of formally in 1713, the French, as you might imagine, are really eager to actually pull Acadians away from their villages on the Bay of Fundy and into French territory. So the French are going to use all sorts of methods to attempt to, in some cases, coerce Acadians into moving onto French territory. The British, of course, are very eager to retain the Acadians because they're the people who know how to make the dikes work, more or less. And so they know how to make Nova Scotia really productive in agricultural terms. So the British, in fact, for the most part, actually want Acadians to stay. They want Acadians to figure out a way to integrate into the culture, the society, the politics of the British Empire. So Acadians are always sort of torn between these two imperial forces that are not just pulling on them in terms of their loyalties and so forth, but that they're actually pulling on them physically. They're trying to get them to move to different places. So Acadians live in, really quintessentially 18th century colonial villages on the one hand. On the other, those villages are always, on some level, kind of unstable because of the pressure they face from the two competing empires.
And it does seem like this instability within these villages came to a head or climaxed in 1755 during the 7 Years or French and Indian War, because in 1755, the British assaulted the Bay of Fundy. So, Chris, would you tell us a bit about that war and how Nova Scotia and the Bay of Fundy fit into it?
Nova Scotia is very much contested ground during the 1750s. It is claimed on some level both by the French, whose settlers remain in peninsular Nova Scotia, and by the British, who have received the province of Nova Scotia in the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht. So what happens in the 1750s, in the run-up to the 7 Years' War, is that the contest for Acadian loyalty really intensifies along the Bay of Fundy. So the French, for example, they construct a really big fortress called Fort Beauséjour. And Fort Beauséjour is right on the border between modern Nova Scotia and modern New Brunswick. And what they try and do with this fort is actually use it as a kind of magnet. They want it to pull all of these Acadians out of British-controlled Nova Scotia and into, in fact, French-controlled New France, more or less. And in fact, they do this. There are lots of Acadians who themselves move to the area around Fort Beauséjour. They start building dikes and, creating farmland and so forth and doing things Acadians do under French control. Now, as the tensions between the French and the British empires come to a head, the British decide to launch an assault on Fort Beauséjour. They see it as a fundamental threat to the security of Nova Scotia. They do this kind of early in 1755. When they do it, quite some number of Acadians, of course, take up arms in defense of Fort Beauséjour, which is, in fact, conquered by the British. The British then use the fact that some number of these Acadians had taken up arms against them as a perfect pretext to launch what they had been contemplating for a few years, and that is the expulsion of the entire Acadian population from Nova Scotia, which they envision being repopulated by proper Protestant British subjects. So the 7 Years' War really is this kind of immediate trigger for something that the British had been contemplating for a long time, and in fact had been planning during the early 1750s. And as soon as they have that perfect pretext with the conquest of Fort Beauséjour, they leap on it and they launch this massive and kind of unprecedented in many ways assault on the civilian population of Nova Scotia.
Wow. It really seems like the British actions were a bit contradictory. I mean, it really seemed like they wanted the Acadians to stay and to integrate into their empire so that they could keep farming and reclaiming these marshlands. And yet, by 1755, they were ready to expel the Acadians from Nova Scotia.
That's right. The British expulsion of the Acadians is an admission of failure. The British had been incredibly eager to figure out a way to fold Acadians into the British Empire. And they had simply failed to do so. And they believed they'd failed to do so in part because of the nature of the Acadians, as they came to see it, but in part because of so much French meddling in Acadian life. And by the time 1755 rolls around and what's going to become the 7 Years' War begins, they have become convinced that there is no way that they can make proper loyal subjects out of Catholic Acadians. They simply don't think it's possible anymore. And so on some level, the move to expel the entire Acadian population is this admission of defeat or failure on the part of the British Empire.
So how did the British actually expel the Acadians? I mean, they certainly want them out of Nova Scotia, but how did they go about actually displacing and removing them from the province?
With a great deal of difficulty. So in the fall of 1755, throughout the Bay of Fundy and wherever Acadians are to be found throughout Nova Scotia, there is a combined force of British regulars, so British troops, and Massachusetts volunteers that begins the process of removing the Acadians. And sometimes they do it by subterfuge. So, for instance, in Grand Pre, which is sort of the biggest Acadian village on the Bay of Fundy, the Massachusetts commander who is leading the expedition, there's been no violence or attack at this point, but he calls a kind of parish meeting and invites all of the men of Grand Pre to meet with him inside their parish church. Once they're in the parish church, he then bars the doors behind them and declares to them that their lands are now forfeit. And as sort of treasonous subjects of the British Crown, they are to be deported. He does this because, given that the wives and families and so forth of these men are still outside occupying the farms, he knows that he can leverage their families to get them to be as docile as they can possibly be during the expulsion. This kind of thing happens all over the Bay of Fundy. They also do it by violence, right? So there are detachments of British regulars or Massachusetts volunteers who simply storm into Acadian villages, imprison the men, women, and children who live there, and haul them off to the coast to await transportation. Now, the transportation occurs in, it's a couple of dozen of actually converted slave ships that are rented from the Boston firm in which John Hancock is a partner. And those ships make their way up to the Bay of Fundy, and they are used as really squalid forms of transport to then ship the Acadians off to a variety of destinations throughout the British Empire.
Yeah, and Kristen has a question about those destinations, and I can't wait to pose it to you right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. I really hope you've been enjoying our conversation about the Acadians, who, as we just heard, were some of the earliest European settlers in North America. You know, learning more about people like the Acadians and their past is a big reason why I enjoy our explorations each week. People like us, we're just really curious, and we always want to learn more about the world. In fact, that's what really motivates me and the Omohundro Institute to produce each episode. We believe that active learning is key to expanding our understanding of the world and the people in it. It's how we get to know who we are and how we came to be who we are. We also believe it's never too early to encourage a love of learning. You know, thinking about it, play has really changed a lot since I was a kid. I mean, when I was growing up, we had big wheels and Rubik's Cubes, and now there's just so much more. And everything seems geared towards learning, which I happen to think is awesome. And that's exactly why I'm telling all my friends with kids to check out KiwiCo. They create these super cool hands-on projects that make STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, a lot of fun. For example, here at the busy Omohundro Institute, Kelly, who maintains all our schedules and so much more, she says she looks forward to getting the KiwiCo crates as much as her 6-year-old son does. She says that the kits are a great chance for them to spend time together, and that the skill level is pitched just right. Not too easy, but also not so hard that they become a source of frustration. Kelly is such an enthusiast that I ordered KiwiCo crates for my niece and nephew, and I really can't wait to try them out. Now, I'm a supporter of any toy that makes it easy for all parents and proud aunts and uncles like me and my partner Tim to have a fun time that also builds creativity and confidence in their kids. And with a KiwiCo subscription, you get a monthly chance to do just that. Now, kits are available for kids ages 0 through 16 years old, and each one arrives right on your doorstep, fully complete. So you won't have to hunt for supplies or realize you have to stop everything just to run to the hardware or craft store. Plus, you can cancel or pause your delivery at any time. So share your love of learning with all the kids in your life by taking advantage of KiwiCo's special offer for Ben Franklin's World listeners. Visit kiwico.com/bfworld and you'll get your first crate free. That's KiwiCo, KIWICO.com/bfworld for your first crate free. kiwico.com/bfworld. KiwiCo. They make learning enjoyable for all kids with strategized and accessible learning projects. Chris, Kristen would like to know where the British sent the Acadians once they deported them from Nova Scotia. So, would you tell us where the British resettled the Acadians and how the Acadians may have experienced their resettlement?
So, in this initial expulsion in 1755, the British send the Acadians to 9 different destinations along the Atlantic coast. So, from Boston in the north all the way down to Savannah, Georgia in the south. This, again, first sort of phase of the expulsion nets about, we're going to say, 7,000 captives. And so those captives are then distributed among the ships, and those ships are then sent off to those 9 provincial cities. And so they're looking to put them in places where they can be contained and perhaps cared for. But for the most part, they're attempting to move them as far away as they possibly can from Nova Scotia, where they believe they'll cause all sorts of trouble, either by allying with the French and their Native American allies, or by assaulting the British force on their own.
Do we have any historical records or accounts that reveal anything about how the Acadians experienced their removal?
We have a few. So much of what we have are observations by people who witness the deportation taking place. And those observations, which again are mostly made by British people or Massachusetts colonists, let's say, who are part of the volunteer expedition to remove them, are incredibly melancholy. The commanding officer of the regiment, who in effect imprisons all of these Acadian men in Grand Pre, he thinks of this as a really difficult and kind of morally ambiguous part of his duty, and I don't think he much cares for it. There are also witnesses, of course, in these Anglo-American cities where the Acadians arrive. Thomas Hutchinson, for instance, who's later going to become the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the 1760s and 1770s. He sort of goes to the docks when ships start arriving with all of these Acadian refugees in Boston. And he records one of the refugees saying to him that his lot, that is the refugees' lot, the Acadians' lot, was the hardest since Jesus Christ was on the earth. So there are lots and lots of different reactions, and those reactions really do differ according to the different sort of cultures and situations of the places where the Acadians get sent. One of my favorite reactions is by the governor of South Carolina, who is himself trying to rule over a frontier province that has French and Native American allies kind of beating down his door out in the West. And he's totally convinced that someone has made a mistake. The governor of Nova Scotia who ordered the expulsion, he actually says, this governor of South Carolina does, he says, look, this guy's hand must have been tired from signing so many documents. He must have sort of written down the number on the form telling us how many Acadians to send to us, because there's no way someone would do this to a fellow sort of governor within the British Empire. So there's lots of different reactions that sort of suggest how the Acadians are experiencing the expulsion and how people are receiving them.
And how many Acadians would say the governor of South Carolina be expected to receive? And was he expected to receive family units, or did the British government separate families?
It's all a mess. So what the governors of Nova Scotia did when they were sort of trying to figure out who to send where is that they wanted to make sure to send the Acadians they believed to be the most dangerous as far away from them as they possibly could. And so what winds up happening is that the Acadians who are captured in and around Fort Beauséjour, most of them, and it's about several hundred of them, get sent to places like Savannah, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina. This, as you can imagine, is incredibly disturbing to the British officials in these two provinces. They're really worried about these guys. As far as how the expulsion takes place, quite frankly, it's a total mess. There are family separations galore. Just to give one example that I write about in the book, there is a group of children, a little group of children, and we're talking about little kids, ages sort of 12 to 3, who are deported along with their grandfather to Connecticut. And the government of Connecticut winds up sort of shoving them off on a little town called Woodbury, Connecticut, where they're housed and they're put in school and so on and so forth. Several months after the deportation, these two just skeletal, emaciated figures walk into Woodbury, and they figure out where these Acadian kids are, and they find them, and they just clutch them to their bodies and refuse to let go. And it turns out that it's their parents. And their parents had been removed to Maryland and had spent the next several months really frantically searching for their children. Finally, they had pestered the governor of Maryland enough that he gave them a travel pass. And they managed to take a seaborne journey from Maryland to New London, Connecticut, and then to walk the better part of 80 miles overland to Woodbury to attempt to find their kids. So there are stories like this aplenty in the Acadian diaspora. So there's relatively little concern taken for the maintenance of family units.
Now, what may seem surprising to us is that after the 7 Years' War, after Great Britain secured victory in that war in 1763, both Great Britain and France experienced uprisings by the enslaved people who lived on several of their colonies. And their solution to preventing further uprisings was to find more dependable colonists. And who did France and Great Britain turn to serve as those dependable colonists but the Acadians? Chris, would you tell us why the French and British turned to the Acadians, to serve as dependable colonists after years of eyeing them with suspicion and as undesirable colonists?
Sure. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, you're absolutely right that the French had witnessed particularly nasty slave uprisings and problems in their Caribbean colonies. So they become convinced that one approach to securing their empire against further British aggression is to ensure a much larger population of loyal and, crucially, white farmers. Now, the Acadians, for the French anyway, have established quite a reputation before the 7 Years' War, but especially during the 7 Years' War. French culture during the middle of the 18th century puts a really, really high premium on patriotism. And the idea that the Acadians, rather than sort of take up arms against the French, actually abandon their own homeland, makes them seem like perfect French patriots in the eyes of lots and lots of officials at Versailles. So the French start to see that at the end of the 7 Years' War, well, wait a minute, there's this really remarkable uprooted population of several thousand incredibly loyal and incredibly skilled agriculturalists who are floating around the Atlantic world. Let's attempt to use them in a way that can sort of shore up our empire against some of the problems it itself is facing. And so as a result, the French concoct a variety of schemes to send Acadian laborers to the tropics. The most famous and in many respects the most tragic case of this occurring happened in what is now French Guiana. The French have, since the 17th century, had a kind of moribund settlement in French Guiana. It's centered on a town called Cayenne. It had always kind of limped along. It's the very sort of edges of the French slave trade and plantation economy. After the 7 Years' War, French ministers and sort of project men get up the idea of establishing a new colony just to the north of Cayenne on the Kourou River in Guyana. And they intend it to be a kind of revolutionary colony in that it's going to be in the tropics, but it's going to be populated exclusively by white peasants. And the French actually recruit upwards of 15,000 white farmers to make the journey to Guyana in 1763 and 1764. One of the linchpins of that recruitment is Acadian refugees. Wherever the French can find them, they promote the idea of going to the Kourou River to these Acadians. They say, this is going to be perfect for you, and you are going to sort of be the shock troops for a great imperial renewal, because you are going to, in fact, grow the food that is necessary to maintain our slave colonies in the Caribbean, so places like Guadeloupe and Martinique and Saint-Domingue. The Kourou colony, of course, turns out to be one of the more sort of unbelievable tragedies in the history of Atlantic migration. These 15,000 white settlers, many of them Acadians, wind up making the transatlantic journey in 1764 before the Kourou colony is ready to receive them. With no place to put them, they are sort of stacked in internment camps on the islands off the coast of Guyana. Thousands upon thousands of these migrants die of yellow fever and malaria and all sorts of other diseases. And the entire affair turns out to be a total debacle. But what's really remarkable about this is, first off, how creative and how interested the French remain in sort of reestablishing their imperial presence in the New World, and how eager they are to make use of loyal and skilled farmers like the Acadians to do so.
And of course, the Kourou River wasn't the only place where the French looked to send Acadians. They also looked to send them to the Falkland Islands. So would you tell us a little bit about the Falkland Islands and why the French wanted to send Acadians there as well?
Well, I don't know if there was a need for Acadians there, but they certainly wanted to send them there. So the Falkland Islands, of course, are off the very southern tip of what is now Argentina. So the very edge of the world in the 18th century. And the Falkland Islands are claimed by the British, the French, and the Spanish in the 17th and 18th centuries. The French are desperate to plant a colony on the Falkland Islands, for one thing, to shore up their claim against British and Spanish pretensions. But for another thing, they want to use the Falkland Islands as a way station to exploration of the Pacific. And this is, I think, the most crucial and maybe most interesting part of all this, they see the Falkland Islands as a stopping point that they can use as they attempt to discover what they then called Terra Australis Incognita, which basically means just unknown southern lands. So for a very, very long time, French explorers and hydrographers and theologians and all sorts of other people had come to believe that there existed a gigantic southern continent, and that this continent was almost certainly inhabited by lots and lots of people. And so what the French are desperate to do after the 7 Years' War is to sort of be the first to make contact with this continent and sort of get their hooks in it as far as commerce goes. And what they believe is that the Falkland Islands can function, again, as a kind of way station for that exploration. And they also want it to grow, potentially, a little bit of food. So they're going to need to provision all these ships and so forth. And they want to do that independently of the Spanish in, again, what is now Argentina. And so they envision, if you can believe it, a kind of agricultural colony on the Falkland Islands. And who better to grow food in some crazy, incredibly cold place like the Falkland Islands than Acadian refugees? So in 1763 and 1764, this really remarkable guy named Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, who's later going to explore Tahiti in the 1760s, that's what he's best known for, he gets up more or less a couple of Acadian expeditions to the Falkland Islands. And the Acadians, in fact, establish a little settlement in Port St. Louis on East Falkland. And, you know, it's sort of a funny thing about the Falkland Islands. It's so remote and so exotic and so forth. And so many of us have read sort of books about Arctic exploration and so forth, that when the Acadians are dumped off in the Falklands by Louis-Antoine de Bougainville in 1764, and then Bougainville leaves, he goes back to France to do other things, I think what a lot of people assume is that they're going to turn to cannibalism. You know, it's going to be sort of a waking nightmare and whatnot. The Falklands is a totally fine place for Acadians to be. They're incredibly successful there. When Bougainville returns, the settlement is thriving. People are having babies. It turns out to be one of the better places, in fact, that these poor Acadian refugees get sent. However, and sort of unfortunately, the French ultimately are forced to relinquish their claim to the Falkland Islands to the Spanish as part of a diplomatic settlement in the 1770s. And so the French colony on the Falklands never quite materializes. Now, there are Acadians who hang on there until probably the mid-1770s. But ultimately, all the Acadians who go to the Falklands wind up filtering back to France, to the port cities of that kingdom, where they await other opportunities.
Now, when many of us think about the Acadians and all the different places they settled, we think about Louisiana. So would you tell us about the Acadian migration to Louisiana and about what the Acadians did once they arrived along the Gulf Coast?
Sure. So the Acadian migration to Louisiana happens in quite a number of stages. So early on, after the 7 Years' War, as early as 1763, the year that the war ends, Acadians all up and down the British seacoast begin kind of getting word that the Spanish are sort of eager to have them as settlers in Louisiana. Now, the French had given Louisiana to the Spanish in a treaty at the end of the 7 Years' War, and they're very eager, the Spanish are, to sort of shore it up demographically. They see the British colonies growing too. They know that the British have just sort of kicked the French out of North America, and they're worried that Louisiana wouldn't be able to stand up to some kind of British advance. So they're eager to put as many people as they can on the frontiers of Louisiana. So initially, anyway, a couple hundred Acadians from places like New York and Philadelphia and Maryland, they actually would make their way by sea to Louisiana and begin setting up sort of rudimentary frontier settlements. Another group of Acadians actually filters into Louisiana in the 1760s from Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue, of course, is the French colony that is now the independent nation of Haiti. Back in the 1760s, of course, it was the major French sugar island. And the French had attempted to establish, again, really quixotically, an all-white settlement in this little town in Saint-Domingue called Mont-Saint-Nicolas. And they envisioned Mont-Saint-Nicolas as kind of half naval base, half agricultural colony, a place to grow food. That settlement fails. And in the mid-1760s, a whole bunch of Acadians from that settlement wind up making their way to Louisiana. So those are sort of the first two groups that make it to the lower Mississippi Valley and that begin to build Acadian settlements in Spanish Louisiana. Now, the largest group, and this is on the order of almost 2,000 Acadians, winds up coming to Louisiana in the 1780s, and they get there actually from France itself. So there's multiple migratory streams that lead Acadian refugees into Louisiana, where again, the Spanish are really eager to receive them. And Acadians begin building frontier settlements in Louisiana, much in the same way that they'd done up in Nova Scotia. They become farmers, they become minor slaveholders, they become ranchers, which is an occupation that many of these folks had pursued up in Nova Scotia. And so they begin to, I wouldn't quite say recreate their homeland in Louisiana. I think that's probably too strong. But they certainly begin to adapt Acadian culture, Acadian practice to a new environment in the lower Mississippi Valley.
And it really does seem like Louisiana may have been a great place for the Acadians to resettle, given that they had all these traditional skills of how to reclaim swamp and marshland and turn it into fertile agricultural fields.
In some respects, they do. They do use some of the skills that they had honed in Nova Scotia in and along the Mississippi River and its tributaries. What's sort of unfortunately missing in Mississippi is those tides. And that's what really made dikeland agriculture up in Nova Scotia along the Bay of Fundy so unique, is that those unbelievable tides in the Bay of Fundy produced all that incredibly fertile farmland that simply needed to be walled off with these dikes and sluices. There's not quite the same thing that goes on in the Mississippi River, but it is absolutely true that the Acadians attempt to sort of transform, to adapt their prior practices to make themselves viable settlers in Spanish Louisiana.
Now, in his book, The Acadian Diaspora, Chris notes that Louisiana existed as one of the most cosmopolitan places in all of early North America. So, Chris, we have to wonder, how did the displaced Acadians factor into Louisiana's cosmopolitanism?
So one of the really striking things about Acadian culture in Louisiana, and your listeners, I'm sure, will know this, but Cajun is the same as Acadian, just in a kind of Louisiana twang. Cajuns, unfortunately, and I think wrongly, are sometimes maligned as being sort of insular. And nothing in the 18th century could be farther from the truth. So the folks in Cajun country in Louisiana in the 1780s and the early part of the 19th century, they had deep, deep international experience. So many of these folks had been war refugees in places, again, like Philadelphia and Maryland and New York and Massachusetts and South Carolina. So they had long experience dealing with Anglo-American cultures and, in fact, with Native Americans of various stripes, right? In addition, no small number of Acadians who settled Louisiana had, in fact, been part of Caribbean settlements, like the failed one on the Kourou River or at Mont Saint-Nicolas in Saint-Domingue. So in many respects, lots of these people had had broad experience dealing with the kind of imperial framework of the Atlantic world in the 18th century. Moreover, another group of Acadians had in fact lived for many, many years in old regime France itself. So if you sort of compare Cajun country in the late 18th century, let's say, to an Anglo-American village in the early American Republic, Cajun country is exceptionally cosmopolitan. It's multilingual, it's multicultural, it's kind of lousy with people who have deep, deep international and inter-imperial experience in a really, really remarkable way.
Speaking of Cajun country, Charlene is really curious about and would like to know how the Acadians went about creating their new settlements in places like Louisiana.
So one of the really striking things about the Acadian diaspora is that there is no question that Acadians attempt to the extent that they can, recreate something of what they had had in Acadia, in Nova Scotia, along the Bay of Fundy. So Acadians are desperate to reunite with their families, right? So that's one of the major drivers of movement and settlement in the Acadian diaspora. Acadians also attempt to make a living in the same way that they had in Nova Scotia. So some Acadians become farmers, some Acadians become ranchers, some Acadians, in fact, become fishermen and so forth. So there's lots of sort of occupational ways in which Acadians try to sort of use their prior experience in Nova Scotia, their family connections, their clan alliances and so forth, to build new settlements in, let's say, places like Louisiana. One thing I think that's important to note, though, is that not all Acadians do this. And in fact, there are quite a number of Acadians who, for lack of a better word, assimilate. That is, they become part of another culture that hosts them. So let me give you one example. I uncovered this really interesting case of a little boy who was probably about 10 years old when he was expelled from Nova Scotia in 1755. And he wound up going to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, along with his parents. Tragically, his parents died relatively soon after reaching Pennsylvania. And so he becomes an orphan. And he inhabits, during the late 1750s and early 1760s, a kind of world of Acadian refugees in Philadelphia that's kind of coherent. So there are, for example, several single Acadian women who all rent a house together, and they use that house as a place to teach Acadian children the Catholic catechism. And this young boy has really vivid memories of going to this house where all these women lived on 6th Street and Pine in Philadelphia and learning his Catholic catechism. At the end of the war, however, he is, again, a kind of atomized and disconnected orphan. And so he becomes an apprentice to a Quaker merchant. And this Quaker merchant has all sorts of business dealings and so forth. And this young Acadian boy becomes sort of accustomed to sort of dealing in Anglo-American commercial networks and whatnot. And he ultimately becomes quite a successful merchant and, in fact, landowner himself. And he anglicizes to the point that he changes his name. So his name that he arrived in Philadelphia with was Charles Leblanc. And he ultimately changes his name to Charles White, which is a rough translation of Leblanc into English. And most of his neighbors only really figure out that this guy that they know was an Acadian refugee when he dies in the 18 teens, and all sorts of family members and people claiming to be family members kind of descend on his fortune and sort of fight it out over his money in the courts. So that's just one example to sort of hint at least a bigger process. Acadians don't robotically attempt to recreate the culture and the sort of village life and so forth that they knew in the Bay of Fundy. Instead, they're forced to make do with the materials that are presented to them in exile. So many of those Acadians join other communities. Many Acadians transform their own Acadian communities to sort of better fit in the context into which they're exiled. So I think it's important to remember that Acadians attempt to reconstruct their sort of prior lives prior to the exile. And they attempt, in many cases, to maintain a sort of distinctive culture. But plenty of Acadians don't see it that way. And they pursue other avenues to survive and, in fact, gain competency in the settings into which they've been dispatched.
So, Chris, in your book, The Acadian Diaspora, you note that historians have tended to view the Acadian story as one of persistence and as one with a happy ending. So I wonder why you think historians have tended to view the Acadian story this way, and whether you think they have the happy ending part of the story right.
So one way of approaching the Acadian diaspora is to treat it as, like I say, a sort of play, and one that has, in fact, a pretty happy ending. There is, of course, the nightmare of the expulsion, which is really horrifying and which results in the destruction of families. It results in thousands of deaths. It is a waking nightmare. And it's a nightmare that we're all relatively familiar with. I was reading the other day that the United Nations has now declared that there are something like 70 million displaced people in the world today as a result of war and famine and all sorts of other problems. The Acadians are living out that process back in the 18th century, and it is awful. It is destructive, and it is terrifying. However, historians have usually suggested that what happens at the end of the diaspora is reunion and the reconstruction of, again, Acadian community, Acadian culture, and in some sense, the triumph of the Acadians over these vast imperial forces that were making them do all of these terrible things back in the 18th century. And I certainly don't want to deny that that's happening. I will say, though, that I think that the Acadians themselves are massively more complicated than that story suggests that they might be. And what I want to suggest is that they are incredibly smart, incredibly canny, and incredibly observant inhabitants of a really rapidly changing imperial world in the 18th century. And they remake their communities to fit in that imperial world. Sometimes, and in some cases, that means doing really awful things to their fellow Acadians. And that happens at a number of points in my book, right? So Acadians throw each other under the bus. They use violence against each other to construct their communities in the way that they think best fits the gigantic imperial market for labor that they are now a part of. So all I would say is that, to be sure, there is a part of the Acadian diaspora that really is happy. And it really is remarkable that these folks managed to sort of rebuild their culture, rebuild their families after the catastrophe of 1755. There is another part of the Acadian diaspora, however, that hasn't, I think, been fully explored by historians. And that is the process by which many Acadians, sometimes as individuals, sometimes as families, sometimes as big communities, think very differently about their position in an imperial world. And they rebuild themselves not simply out of a desire to reclaim the past, but to compete in what they see as a kind of cutthroat imperial future.
We should move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if the geopolitics of the 18th century had been different and the Acadians had been allowed to stay in Nova Scotia after 1755?
Here's my best guess. So let's imagine that in 1755, somehow or other, the Acadians come to some negotiated agreement with the British authorities, and they are allowed to stay in their villages along the Bay of Fundy if they don't take up arms, if they maintain neutrality. So in that case, these 15,000 Acadians would have remained in the Bay of Fundy in the 1760s and 1770s. So my best guess is that if the Acadian expulsion had never happened, there could have been a 14th mainland British colony to rebel against the British Empire in the 1770s. There are Acadians who actually did remain in and around New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. They managed to escape the expulsion and so forth. And some are actually invited back in the 1760s and 1770s. And they make all sorts of interesting noises during the American Revolution about the potential of supporting the patriot movement that's going on in the colonies to their south. My best guess is that during the 1770s, had there been no expulsion, those Acadians would have jumped all over the patriot movement. And the early United States would have, interestingly, potentially, included a 14th state that would have been inhabited in large part by French-speaking Catholics. And that would have had all sorts of really interesting ramifications for the way that American politics and culture would have developed in the early republic. So that's my best guess.
So in reality, as well as in the context of this hypothetical time warp, Acadians really occupied a very complicated place in history.
Yes, they absolutely do. And it's also true that, the first thing that the American patriots do during the American Revolution, once they figure out that they want to be independent, is they go and invade Canada, which fails massively because the Canadians of the St. Lawrence River Valley don't particularly want anything to do with this sort of bizarre rebellion that's going on to their south. My best guess would be that the Acadians might have thought a little bit differently than their French-Canadian compatriots about the rebellion, and that they may well have taken the chance to overwhelm the massively numerically inferior British government in Nova Scotia and take part in the patriot movement themselves. So if the expulsion had not occurred, I think it would have radically changed the American Revolution, the way that the early United States developed, and it also would have radically changed the way Canada developed, right? So without the maritime provinces, how would Canada be different? I think pretty substantially.
So Chris, what aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Right now, I am just finishing up a co-authored book with my friend and colleague, Brett Rushforth, who teaches at the University of Oregon. And we are just about done with a book that is a big history of France and the New World, so Africa and the Americas, from the medieval period up through the early 19th century. So that's the big book project I've been focusing on for the last little while. I'm also intending to write, and I've started researching this, and I'm very excited about it, kind of a quasi-biography of an American loyalist named Benjamin Thompson. Thompson was just sort of this regular guy from Massachusetts, but who happened to think the American Revolution was bogus. And so he bugs out in 1775 and then splits the next 3 decades of his life between London, Paris, and Munich. And he actually winds up dying as a count in the Holy Roman Empire. So I've long been fascinated by this guy. He sort of lives the age of revolution in reverse. He starts off as the sort of citizen of this autonomous republic in Massachusetts and ends up as an old regime aristocrat. So I'm going to write a biography of him.
And where's the best place to contact you if we have more questions about the Acadians and the Acadian diaspora?
So I have a personal page on the website of the History Department of Brigham Young University. And you're more than welcome to email me at chris_Hodson@byu.edu.
Christopher Hodson, thank you so much for joining us and for helping us explore the Acadian diaspora.
Thank you.
The way the Acadians used and developed the marshlands of Nova Scotia became legendary. And because of the geographic position of these lands, seemingly every empire in Europe wanted to control them. So between the 17th and 18th centuries, the French-speaking Catholic Acadians lived under French, English, Dutch, and British rule. But no matter which rule the Acadians lived under, their loyalties were always thought to be suspect, especially when viewed through British eyes. The Acadians spoke French, worshipped as Catholics, and they traded with everyone and anyone who might meet their needs. The British found this all to be very disloyal, especially when they also feared that French meddling might encourage the Acadians to attack them. So in 1755, during the early days of the 7 Years or French and Indian War, the British attacked the French and secured Nova Scotia and the Bay of Fundy for Great Britain. And once they held firm control over this territory, they sought to retain their control by removing what they saw as the most serious threat to their power, the Acadians. So British regulars and Massachusetts provincial soldiers rounded up about 7,000 Acadians and forcibly transported them to one of 9 different destinations along the North American Atlantic coast. Now, in the process of their expulsion, friends and families were separated, and children sometimes found themselves in different colonies from their parents. The eyewitness accounts we have of the Acadian removal from Acadia shows that the Acadians experienced this departure as among the hardest experiences ever faced by humans. Now, although some Acadians would return to Nova Scotia after the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, many did not. They found themselves in places like France, French Guiana, the Falkland Islands, Philadelphia, or in Spanish Louisiana. In each place, Acadians made a decision. Some decided to assimilate and adapt into the local cultures of their displacement, but others attempted to retain as much of their culture as possible by recreating the village life that they had once enjoyed along the shores of the Bay of Fundy. Now, as Chris related, the Acadians did not robotically try to recreate their former way of life, but they did try to use their knowledge of that way of life to use the tools and resources available to them in these new areas to create new settlements. Now, the forced removal of the Acadians and their diaspora around the Atlantic world is an event that happened in the past, but it's also a phenomenon that we still live with and see today. Today, we can see all sorts of migrations happening because of violence or shortages of needed resources. And just as with the Acadian diaspora, these migrations result in thousands of deaths and the separations of families. It's by looking at stories like the Acadians that we can see how these present-day migrating peoples might think about the geopolitical world around them, how they might adapt their former ways of life to their new conditions, and how they might overcome or succumb to the great tragedy of their experience. You'll find more information about Chris, his book, The Acadian Diaspora, plus notes for everything we talked about on today's show on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/232. KiwiCo makes learning enjoyable for all kids with strategized and accessible learning projects. And they're offering you a special offer just for being a Ben Franklin's World listener. Visit kiwico.com/bfworld and get your first crate free. That's kiwico.com/bfworld and get your first crate free. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you really enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team. Joseph Edelman, Kim Foley, Martha Howard, Emily Sneff, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, what do you think about the Acadian diaspora? Do you think we can get too mired in viewing their story as a happy one? I'd love to know what you think, so please drop me a line. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.